Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is another lecture in our series uh, for our Intro to Critical Theory course. And I didn't in the syllabus have us read anything directly related to psychoanalysis, although our next reading after Hannah Arendt is going to be Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance, in which he delves into a lot of language that and just sort of background theoretical concepts that come from Sigmund Freud. And so I feel like I needed to make a video just glossing some of the major contours of Freudian thought. If you are coming to this and you have already decided everything about Freud, I want you to ask yourself how much Freud you've read and where you might be getting those thoughts. Just like a lot of my students come into class and have already pre-shaped opinions about Marx, but they really haven't ever read any Marx. My intention is not at all in any way to present Freud as being medically relevant. In any kind of particular form, although we definitely, I mean, I've been in therapy for years and I'm not afraid to admit it, not necessarily psychoanalytic therapy, but some of the, having read a lot of Freud and also looked at different therapeutic models, he is still in there in the background. He's also really old, right? We don't apply Freud from 1915 to 2024. That is not the intention here at all. But you need to understand some of Freud's concepts if you are going to understand Marcuse and Marcuse's cultural critique. Uh, if this were a more advanced critical theory class, we would delve a lot more into Freud. We would delve into Jacques Lacan. The whole sort of discourse around psychoanalysis is so huge that for an intro course, I couldn't really fit it in very well for a whole semester. So that's why the gloss in for this lecture. I want to put Freud into context with some of the other major moves in late 19th century thought and 19th/early 20th century philosophy, because when we put him in that context, we can see that he's by far no lone voice. And despite the fact that some of his theories are seem perhaps ridiculous to us today, um, within his own time period, he's pretty much a scholar and an academic, citing other people's sources quite a bit, looking at the new field of anthropology, especially, and drawing on what he thought was as the most current research of his time period. Um, like Marx, Freud develops a theory of society where what we see is not necessarily what we get, that there's something deeper driving society. Freud's name for this is the unconscious. He is not the first person to come up with this. It is clearly in emergent thought. It's very much in, there's quite a bit of Freud in Feuerbach, who we looked at briefly earlier this semester. And I think, the more I teach philosophy, uh, and religious studies over the years, I see Freud pulling, especially from concepts of the soul in Plato and Aristotle. And what I mean by that is that there's an idea of a three-partite soul in both Plato and Aristotle, although they come at it in different angles, as I said in my last lecture. And by the way, I did make a mistake in my last lecture. I was confusing Alcibiades, who's a Athenian statesperson and part of a character in a different Plato dialogue than Polemarchus, who's at the beginning of Plato's Republic. Although they're making similar arguments about power and that the person who is happiest in society is the one who is unjust or who just gets power. Uh, in both Plato and Aristotle, what they do in reaction to that kind of thinking is they develop a three-partite notion of the soul, where reason is on top, indignation is the second quality, the saying no, and base desires are at the bottom. So those are the three parts. It's quite easy to see that Freud's notions of id being base desires or libido, ego, the sense of self, the ego just is the Greek word for the first person I, which basically affirms and rejects what it likes or dislikes. And then superego being something like reason, right? So Freud's spread throughout Euro-Christian culture, and I'm still using that term Euro-Christian, knowing, of course, that Freud is Jewish and not religiously Jewish, but definitely persecuted by Nazis. He has to leave the European continent, like any other Jews fortunate enough to escape Nazis. um, and so Freud Freudian thought fits within a much sort of bigger culture milieu. You can call it Western civilization if you want, but we're seeing more and more in scholarly thought that even that idea, the intellectual idea of Western civilization, is kind of the product of Enlightenment type of era, which is already Euro-Christian. But then it gets cast back as if it were some sort of kind of linear progress narrative. Um, and so that's why it can sometimes seem confusing. So again, as always, I use the term Euro-Christian as one word lowercase. It's about a social movement. It's about not being able to divorce concepts of religiosity from concepts of politics and even sometimes the state. In my book, A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics, I call this the European fantasy structure. I would now use the term Euro-Christian fantasy structure to describe a certain worldview um, that is evolutionary in scope, which means that it's temporally linear, um, that time progresses, that human civilization progresses in a quasi evolutionary way. Yes, we can see this in Hegelian concepts of history, in Marxian concepts of history, like so beyond Freud for sure. And what Hannah Arendt gave us in our last reading is a thought heuristic, a kind of tool of thought called the state of nature. We can see the state of nature definitely as an emergent sort of discourse in Plato's Republic here as well. So the modernist philosophers, political philosophers, just like Freud, are drawing back on thinkers like Plato. And so when Freud comes out with his theories, although they're biologically based at the beginning, or he wants them to be biologically based, he's trained as a neurologist, but their neurological theory is at its very, very beginning stages. What Freud does as a clinician is he tries to turn towards culture, towards an account of culture, which is why he turns to anthropologists to try and give an account for what he thinks of as mechanisms that are going on in our brains. And so partly in turning to cultural analysis, that's why we get a metaphor like the Oedipal complex, for example, which is in which he's returning to Greek mythology, but he has cast Greek mythology into that kind of linear development model of civilization. Other aspects of the Euro-Christian fantasy structure. Humans are above animals. There's something special about humans. Even in Hebrew context, right? Even in Hebrew Genesis story, humans are above. animals, but we definitely get a radicalization of that in New Testament thought, a focus on humans as being somehow special, as containing some sort of image of God, and having that image of God being aligned with the capacity for reason. Uh, in that context, it is also gendered. So in the European or Euro-Christian fantasy structure, men have traditionally been figured as being above women. Men move out of a state of nature into rational society. Society, in romantic thought, like Rousseau, creates a citizen. The citizen is a different thing than so-called natural man. The citizen is a kind of automaton, um, as opposed to natural man, because men were conceived as having a higher capacity towards rationality and reason in this sexist structure. Women are not only lower, but they are closer to nature. Children are closer to nature. So-called primitive people, like indigenous peoples, are also closer to nature. They are outside of society and Euro-Christian civilization. In order to participate in Euro-Christian civilization, they must become civilized. They must go through a vertical cultivation process in which they give up all of their own cultural trappings and languages and customs and all of that in order to join so-called civilized, secular, but implicitly Euro-Christian society, right? Which of course is genocidal towards indigenous peoples. This is not a true way of thinking about how the world works. It is a fantasy structure developed and conglomerated over multiple cultures in Europe over time. Um, it is not just Italian culture or French culture or German culture or English culture, right? So we have different cultures, but crossing all of those cultures and perhaps beneath them is an idea of religion and religiosity, which comes from Christianity, right? Whether it's Catholic or Protestant, right? The drama of the Catholic Protestant violence that shapes so much of what becomes early state theory in Europe is part of a Euro-Christian drama. Persecution of Jews is, of course, part of Euro-Christian drama. Jews who are existing in this society, like Freud, are negotiating that situation, just like any of the other critical theorists that we have been looking at so far throughout this course. And so, yes, there are sometimes implicit critiques like endarkenment, as I said in an earlier lecture. There are the critiques of society that are coming from people like Emmanuel Levinas and Horkheimer and Adorno and the critical theorists who are giving us a different account of Western civilization. And they're drawing on a deeply historical Jewish critique that comes with the kind of second sight, to again use W.E.B. Du Bois's thinking with in terms of race, right? For Black folks in the United States, um, later African Americans, that's not his term. Uh, and it's the partly being marginalized that gives you kind of this feeling of two-ness, this feeling of second sight. And so that's where some of this critique is coming from, not recognizing that critique, or not recognizing that rejection of that critique of Western civilization might be coming from a marginalized perspective is where we sometimes see anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish thought and the rejection of critical theorist thinkers. So that's just something that is part of the situation there. So Freud, participating in this broader milieu of the ways of thinking about society, develops a schema for thinking about um, not only the human mind or the psyche for the psychology of the human mind, but he's trying to fit that into current science for his time. And he is then also trying to give a broader account of culture. Um, So what he does is he says that uh, our minds have a kind of mechanism by which we have to filter out or make sense of our experience in the world. And we do this through a mechanism of repression of things that we cannot have and a manifestation of that later on. So the idea of the unconscious is that like there's too much beneath us, there's too much experience that we are taking in. Our mind kind of acts as a like a filtering mechanism for consciousness, and it in doing so we create a liminality, right? So subliminal means under, subliminal means under the things that we are consciously aware of. Above that might be something like conscious or consciousness. Freud's terms for this are latent, things that are underneath are latent, and things that are above are manifest. And this is because he thinks that repression is something that we as humans in our human minds actually do from the time that we are quite young. He uses the Oedipal complex as a way to try and give a metaphor for this structure. The Oedipal complex is not about wanting to have sex with your mother. For example, what he's doing is he uh, is thinking like a biologist. He thinks that we have a drive for life, right? That the idea of any species, what a species needs and wants to exist, is the perpetuation of life. And that is happening at a cellular level from the time that we are born and as we grow up, right? So the baby is not a sexual being in the sense of um, the ways that we might think of teenagers or adults as sexual beings, but in terms of libido, a broader sort of idea of what libido is or getting our needs met. Which so of course, do we have a drive to eat? Do we have it like a baby comes out and if they're healthy, they're able to start sucking from the beginning, right? So that they can take in nourishment from the mother. Um, we need the basic needs to get by, and sexuality will become is part of that at its base, but it becomes something much bigger as we grow. And so uh, Freud says that when the baby, first comes out, um, they're still forming. I'm not going to go into Lacan right now, but his mirror stage is very similar to this kind of stuff. Lacan is one of Freud's big students. He's important for critical theory. Um, the baby needs the mother, and the baby particularly needs the mother's breast because the breast is the source of all life, traditionally speaking, for a baby. That's how the baby knows that they're going to live. And so the baby forms a particular attachment and bond to the mother. And as the baby grows and the mother gets uh, a little bit more assured that the baby's going to be okay, the mother has to naturally start paying attention to other things, right? When the mom pays attention to something else, the baby has no control over that sort of situation, right? And so it can cause frustration. Or if the mom puts the baby down and goes to another room, imagine it from the baby's perspective. Your whole life source has just disappeared. And so it can be probably really distressing. We have games that we play with babies like peekaboo, and that kind of repetition of the game is saying, I'm going away, I'm coming back. I'm going away, I'm coming back. So the baby is developing a kind of idea of mother or nourishing sense. And also, as the baby becomes okay and feels secure and feels safe, comes to know that mom might not be in the room, but mom is going to be coming back, something like that, right? Um, as the baby develops more, the baby develops more of a sense of ego, more of a sense of self, but also is not yet able to articulate itself. And so when things distract mother, the baby develops a sense of competition in a very heteronormative uh, family model from late 19th century Viennese society that Freud uses. The first person who might be a distraction to mom is the father, his dad, right? So the baby develops a sense of competition with the father, but the father is always going to be, at least at this point, more powerful than the baby. The baby can't do anything about it. Um, Mom keeps paying attention to dad, and what the baby must learn in this stage, even though it's developed a libidinal attachment to the mother. That's why people like claim it's about wanting to have sex with the mother, or that there are like later pathologies that develop for something like that. The idea is an attachment to a sense of oneness that comes from before individuation from the mother. So it's that drama of individuating oneself from the mother. In that process, the mechanism of repression emerges. The baby cannot have mother's breast or mother's attention at all times. Something comes in to distract the mother. The baby learns to move that desire for the thing it cannot have and attach it to something else, right? So the thing that you want is repressed into the unconscious, and then it manifests again, but it manifests as something in a symbolic order. Maybe it's Teletubbies. Maybe it's light up sneakers. Maybe it's a security blanket. Maybe it's a pacifier, right? Whatever whatever it is part of a process of the baby detaching itself healthily from the mother, and growing up, and eventually moving beyond that Oedipal stage. Freud says that when something in that stage is not necessarily fully worked out yet, we return back to the Oedipal drama, right? So he then, in the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, attaches the Oedipal drama to a development of civilization itself, right? This is a big problem in Euro-Christian thought, but Freud is not the only person to do it, right? Adam Smith does this. Many economic thinkers develop a sort of stages of civilizational development model, that is not necessarily right or true, especially by 21st century standards. And yet it influences our society as well. In Freudian terms, the libido or the drive to live is called eros. It's the Greek word for love. And it's the drive, the instinct that to get the things that we need in life. Although Freud didn't really use the term, the opposite of that among other thinkers is Thanatos, which is the Greek god of death, right? So sometimes we talk in terms of psychoanalytic language between Eros and its opposite Thanatos. That is important because it informs this later theory of Freud's called the death drive, which he develops in the 1920 book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The pleasure principle is just that eros or libidinal impulse, that what we do is we seek the things that give us pleasure in life so that we can perpetuate life, including sex, including tasty food, whatever it happens to be, right? He doesn't make up the term death drive. He gets it from Sabina Spielrein, who's a thinker who's influenced by Freud and Jung. She wrote a paper in 1912 called Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being. And what interests Freud about Spielrein's paper is that beyond the pleasure principle, beyond just getting pleasure or avoiding pain. Um, Freud has been dealing with soldiers from the First World War. Very much like the critical theorists we've been studying, Freud is trying to think about like what were the causes of the World War? What is the destruction, the fallout of the war, its implications for society? This is Beyond the Pleasure Principle is quite soon after World War One. But what he noticed in looking at soldiers in World War One is that soldiers who've been traumatized or shell shocked in World War One replay the trauma over and over again in their heads. This is something this in trauma theory today, it is the same sort of thing. It's the same like that Freud is noticing, right? Like all of Freud's ideas don't necessarily work, but he seems to be onto something here when he notices that trauma is replayed over and over again. He also noticed that when he was looking at children, and children are growing up, that children tend to restage um, the same dramas. Or sometimes, if you think about even reading books to children, like a lot of times, like children don't want a different book, a different bedtime story every night. Sometimes they just want Good Night Moon for a really, really long time. Like my sister says, man, like my kids, like they want a Good Night Moon for a really, really long time over and over again. So there's something about repetition that allows us to, I think, maybe have a sense of security or comfort. The third thing that Freud seems to notice is that uh, we develop, especially with trauma, we might develop obsessively repeated um, uh, uh, behaviors that we need to make ourselves feel safe, to alleviate our neuroses. And that obsession and repetition, Freud noticed, sometimes occurs instead of actually remembering or reliving the traumatic events. So it becomes a way to avoid reliving those events. And so even though Freud himself, in his writings at this time says that this death drive idea is, you're gonna have to, take it however you will. It might be something like an urge to a pre-organic state. That like if the Oedipal complex is kind of wanting to get back to the safetiness of the womb, that the death drive is trying to get to something before that. Hard to justify, right? But when we're thinking about cells and cell development, and biology outside of consciousness, that then it starts to make a little bit more sense what Freud is kind of thinking of there. So again, the pleasure principle in Freud is just how we seek pleasure and avoid pain. What happens is we develop an ego, a sense of I, a sense of personality or identity, and that's separated from id. We have libidinal impulses, but we know that we can be driven towards something that might feel good to a certain point, and then it doesn't feel good, right? Feels good to be by a warm fire, get too close to the fire, and you get burned, right? So, how do we understand that kind of necessary balance? That's the ego avoiding pleasure, or sorry, avoiding pain, and seeking out pleasure. Countering that, Freud develops the reality principle. The reality principle, so we have the id and the ego. The reality principle is just coming to terms with the fact that we cannot always have the things that we want when we want to have them. You can't just have sex with anybody that you feel you're attracted to. um, uh, that the supermarket something might look good, but you might not have the money to buy it, like that kind of stuff. So the reality principle is a kind of rational way of assessing the real world and what we can and cannot have. This is the super ego. So it comes in as a way to negotiate between the id and the ego. It is completely there in Plato and Aristotle. This is not Freud's own sort of his own invention. And that's partly why I think Freud's thought was so compelling to a lot of people, because he might have a little bit different terminology, but he's drawing on stuff that is part of his cultural milieu and that's operating at a kind of deeper level. In his later book from around 1930, Civilization and its Discontents, Freud starts dealing with um, religion. Freud is not religious at all. He thinks he's a rational mind, and he generally thinks that people who are religious are stuck in the past in some sort of archaic sense of the past, right? He's very Darwinian. He's very much like on an evolutionary track, and he sees it as a regressive trait to be into religion. So he says, well, Freud, does not have these religious impulses. He says there is something to be said about accounting for this oceanic feeling. And he's in conversation and letters with some folks about this, as I cover in my book. I'm not going to go into that right now. He says that religion develops as a kind of social structure or a coping mechanism to deal with an oceanic feeling. Religion develops as a way of making sense of immense amounts of information coming into us as beings who are growing up. And to make sense of that, we might have a super ego on top of us that is something like a capital G God, right? Um, Again, in a heteronormative structure that has privileged male superiority for centuries, the father figure is going to be aligned with law, is going to be aligned with something like God, right? And that goes back even to pre-Christian Judaic times and patriarchal culture there. So, um, Freud says the problem, like civilization presents humanity with a kind of problem because on the one hand, humans developed civilization as an adaptive strategy to acclimate in a purely evolutionary Darwinian type of way to the difficulties of living in the world. It's both an adaptive tool that humans invent, but what they invent also at the same time is a tool for their own repression, something that subjugates or represses their desires. In the next part of his book, he then returns to earlier theories from a book called Totem and Taboo from around 1913, I think is when that's published, where he developed, from looking at anthropology of the time, he looked at uh, theories about cultures who are indigenous and who use something like the totem. And again, what he does is he applies and relegates indigenous people to the Euro-Christian fantasy structure. So he calls indigenous peoples primitive, maybe not all, completely in the sense that they're unevolved, but they also are give us a somehow a view into an earlier state, a pre-civilizational state, a um, state of nature, right? So even though Hannah Arendt says, oh, the state of nature is just this, it's just a heuristic idea, that is not what was happening in anthropology and psychology and the sciences. Because what happens is that the Euro-Christian mind tries to create a taxonomy of cultures all the way around the world. It's not just Freud, it's Hume, it's Kant, who think that Africans somehow don't have civilization and so they're not as evolved, and so it becomes racialized completely. And so uh, uh, Freud is when people vilify Freud without sort of taking an account of how this is playing into a much larger worldview or fantasy structure. So I'm not claiming that it's real, right? It's a fantasy structure that's very seductive and that's caused a lot of destruction in the world. So in this logic, in Freud's logic from this time, he's speculating on a sort of like something, some kind of a pre-civilizational aspect, maybe even earlier forms of us being apes, as you see in like Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey in the opening scenes, right? So it might be something before we even become modern Homo sapiens as humans. He says that what happens is that in a early society, only the dominant males are able to sexually reproduce. They have sexual control over the females of the population. This makes the lesser males all very frustrated because they can't compete with this. And so we've seen this kind of stuff going into analyses of silverback gorillas or something like this, right? Um, there's a really nice PBS documentary right now. So a lot of current science is even like that looks at apes is challenging these kinds of masculinist, Darwinist kind of conceptions from early on and looking much more at the ways that societies of apes, including us, cooperate with each other, right? So this is a different kind of angle of looking at things. Again, I've mentioned David Graeber's and David Wethnow's book, uh, The Dawn of Everything, which is dealing with some of this sort of stuff. But in social theory, whether it's political thought or biological thought, for a long time, there was this idea put forth by Herbert Spencer and some of the people that really influenced Freud to begin with, that saw everything in terms of competition, right? Competition over resources. We see that in Marx. We see that in economic thought. And that's not necessarily true. It's part of a Euro-Christian fantasy structure that is so deeply embedded for many of us that we don't even necessarily see it because it's repeated over and over again that like life is about the competition over scarce resources and that it's a dog eat dog type of world and it's all up to you as an individual to compete and struggle. And in that view, of course, you don't see yourself as being part of a society or being socialized. And of course, this is what Freud is trying to do in Civilization and its discontents is trying to figure out that kind of tension between individual and society, right? That's what he's trying to do anyway. So he says in early human society, maybe this is the birth of religion or something like this, that what happens is eventually the younger or the weaker males get together and they're like, look, I alone can't defeat this tyrannical father type of figure who has control over all of the females in the population. So what we need to do is we need to band together and we can overthrow him and then we can live too. And this becomes a cooperative type of principle. They kill the father and then they start feeling guilt because they maybe, are initially are able to have sex, but then the rest of their social order is kind of disrupted. And so what do? They set up a totem. This is all in Freudian thought, right? I'm not claiming that this is correct necessarily. I'm just explaining his thought. But they set up a totem and the totem comes in to stand for that father. That father figure becomes the law of the father. It becomes later on patriarchy in something like the Old Testament or a Yahweh type of figure god who comes as a conglomeration of other gods, right? Like as something like a monotheistic culture is developing over time, right? So Freud is thinking of in very literary ways, but also in evolutionary ways as he's coming up with his theory. Um, he says eventually, so then we get this kind of absent father who's the lawgiver, right? And that the lawgiver it acts as at the societal level as the kind of superego, just as at the individual level, the rationality of the superego is that capability to control our desires and to control our ego. But that when we look back to Plato and the Republic and like that's it's quite similar in there, right? So again, we want to put Freud into a bigger context. He then, in Civilization and its Discontents, takes that idea of the replacing of the father figure with the totem, and the taboo is called totem and taboo, which is a bastardized term from Maori culture, right in the Far East. Like, well, Freud doesn't know anything about that culture, but he uses that term and it to mean something different, right? Or I think I'm just gonna, well, sorry, I'm confused. I think taboo is like actually North American culture, but mana is from Maori culture. Taboo might be. You have. Yeah, don't quote me on that right now. I might have. There are different. It could be that totem is a North American word. He's drawing on anthropologists who have thrown all indigenous cultures into this one category of so-called primitive society. Um, and yeah, it is feeling like that taboo is Maori, but maybe totem is North American right now. But mana is also another term that comes up, and I think that's Maori as well. Excuse my brain there. Maybe I need more coffee. Uh, yeah. So he returns. So he says that from these early aspects of society, we start getting taboos. The taboo of incest, for example, he calls an ancient taboo. But even if I mean, I just taught Genesis from the Bible last week, and Abraham is like marrying his half sister. We have got cousins marrying each other, so that is not necessarily um maybe as old even as Freud wants to put it, not to mention royal societies and like families that seem to be very incestuous and even into more recent times. But um, he's so yeah, I'm not going to deal too much more with the taboo against incest here. He returns then to the idea of the death drive, though, in Civilization, and he says that what happens is civilization um, uh, we have a kind of impulse to hurt ourselves, right? Um, that something happens when we're depressed or we like to do destructive things. We drink heavily, even though it might be unhealthy for us. We smoke cigarettes, even though it might be we know that it's bad for us, but we still do it, right? So that's part of where the death drive comes from as well. But it somehow seems to be linked to trauma as well, that we might cut ourselves or hurt ourselves in order, we might administer pain to ourselves in order to feel better, like a kind of masochistic quality, right? Um, he says that what happens is that might happen on the individual level, but at the social or civilizational level, the repression of the death drive gives rise to neurosis in society, and it gives rise to us having a guilty conscience. And this will be something that he believes that we need as humans to work through. And when we don't resolve that, that's the kind of stuff that drives us into um, uh, self-destructive behavior. That at a mass level, this is what causes wars, for example, because we have not been able to sort of work through those issues. Um, that all of this stuff up to this point has just been Freud. Remember, as I've been characterizing critical theorists of this time period, that critical theory is trying to account for an irrational element in society that produces something like world wars, that produces something like beneath instrumental reason, right? On the one hand, instrumental reason is going to destroy us. Instrumental reason is kind of like the ego at society's level, right? But it's the ego out of control. It's the ego that then uh, at the social level pushes us towards something like the death drive of like the atomic bomb, right? Let's just blow up the whole species. And then then the impulse back and forth to say, like, we're going to make a Cold War, we're going to have the bigger weapons, but the weapons are going to be um, uh, like the bomb to end all bombs, and then we will bring about some sort of new society or something like that, right? Of course, Freud dies before the atomic bomb goes off, but we can see how his thinking might be developing. And it is Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School theorists who turns to a version of Freud's thinking in his work, especially in Eros and Civilization, which this uh, is a big book. I might do another lecture just on Eros and Civilization to help give us some glue. But in the late 40s and 50s, Marcuse turns to Freudian thought. And at this point in time, so Freud is dead. Before World War II, there are hardly any psychoanalysts in the United States, but then very quickly after World War II, the whole profession of psychoanalysis explodes in the United States. Why? Because we have a bunch of traumatized veterans returning from the war, right? And so we get not only an explosion in the profession, we get an explosion of publications, and we get Americanized versions of Freudianism that do things that Freud never really said, especially things about gender therapy. Some of the ways that homosexuals were treated, for example, not so much as, although you can trace some of the thinking maybe back to Freud, but the treatment of them and institutions in the United States, the pathologization of that kind of stuff is definitely takes on its own sort of bastardized form of Freudianism. And Marcuse calls this out in this book, right? So that's why I might thinking about maybe another lecture, but because I've written a lot on this, but um, this is where I don't want you to confuse, like, I don't know, religious camps that are trying to do conversion therapy for homosexuals or something like that, based on some sort of outdated Freudian models. That kind of stuff, that there's so much more in between Freud and that kind of stuff, that I don't want to confuse Freud that way. Is Freud generally working in sort like binary gender constructs? He is more he's more subtle and nuanced than you might think when you actually look at him in terms of thinking about different genders. But he definitely, of course, uses an Oedipal or the electric complex. He definitely uses gender binaries for his time. His student Jacques Lacan opens that up a little bit more, but still, according to feminist psychoanalysts, he still has some work to do to get beyond his own gendering. But there's definitely a lot more fluidity. And what we're dealing with is something like, as all of these people, including Marcuse, will say, is that really what we're dealing with when we're talking about psychology here is we're looking at names for talking about a symbolic order. We're talking about something inside the psyche, and the way that the psyche or the imagination forms things. It may not correspond to actual real life. So when people are like, that's bullshit, that doesn't correspond to my own particular experience. It's like, that's not exactly what we're dealing with. Just like any of the critical theorists, we're trying to give an account of something that happens at the social level. We're dealing with something like the symbolic order, which, how do we analyze something like the symbolic order? We look at things toward like aesthetics and culture, right? That's exactly what the other critical theorists were doing during this particular moment in the 40s and 50s. Are their accounts of culture correct by today's standards? Probably not, right? Like, they're certainly not giving accounts of things that Marx had been able to give an account of as well, right? So, they are intellectuals who are dealing with the current thoughts and um, uh, ideas that are of their time period, and they're trying to make sense of their lives. That's what we kind of do as humans. So I tend to be a generous reader of people when we're trying to figure out what people are trying to figure out what went wrong with their society, right? They're in a post-war moment. Like they're in a moment where the world could destroy itself, and they're really intensely trying to figure out some way to talk about it, right? And it's like we can have a little bit of generosity towards people who are thinking about things, uh, and especially without blaming them for the ways that other people have taken all of their ideas and maybe done something really horrible with their ideas, whether it's Marx or Freud or anybody. At the very least, at least we by doing this kind of work we of critical theory, we can look and make sense of the perhaps flawed logic of um, applying Marx to something like as Hannah Arendt was saying in last week's reading, right? Of uh, of she was talking about the immense bravery of the sort of the revolutionaries in the Bolshevik Revolution, like for being able to subordinate their own selves and their own needs to the creation of this Soviet state, right? And that there's this massive amount of destruction that comes from that sort of thing that would definitely look to somebody like Freud, like at the mass level, something like a death drive in human culture. Um, Remember, Hannah Arendt wanted to go back to Aristotle and give a kind of almost virtue ethics type of account that might align with something like liberalism. Marcuse is going to take us in a completely different direction, and he's going to um, he's going to point out flaws in Freudian thought. So he's well aware that there are problems with Freud's thought. And he really doesn't like the way that Freud has been received in the United States in Eros and Civilization as well, right? So he's going to distinguish himself from this whole sort of industry, one might call it, around around Freudianism as it becomes part of the therapeutic culture in the United States. And he's definitely continuing to use Freud's thoughts to articulate something else. What he will do is he turns to aesthetics and to culture, what he will later call something like the aesthetic impulse in society. And he says that in almost a quasi Aristotelian way, he says that what civilization produces is art and aesthetics to help us sort of work through the um, the destructive impulses in society. It also um, gives us a way of thinking about mass culture and consumer society and what it produces for us at a kind of egoistic or libidinal type of level. But how that libidinal level taken to its own extreme is going to increase our neuroses. It's going to increase our guilty consciences, but through repression of the death drive. And so what he wants to do is talk about the ways that something like in the essay Repressive Tolerance, which we're reading next, he's going to say, like, yes, liberal society promotes the idea of tolerance as being a good thing. Earlier on, when liberal society is developing, tolerating other people's religions, tolerating people's differences, of course, becomes is good. Just like Marx said that bourgeois society, when it overthrows feudalism, is initially good. But later on, the revolutionary impulses of those movements that are push us towards more equitability then become sort of tools for the colonization of one's mind or become tools for the further repression of one's mind. And this is what is happening at the level of civilization. And so when he's talking about repressive tolerance, he says that the things that we used to say that make us feel free or liberated no longer liberate us anymore. They've become subsumed by a society that is verging towards totalitarianism, and they are presented as freedom. They're presented as choice to us. But what that freedom on the surface is looking like it's doing is actually a further cause of repression. And we need to do the analytical work, i.e., critical theory, in order to unpack how that works. It is intellectual work. But it also helps us alleviate the guilty conscience. Now, Marcuse's thought goes in to inform a lot of thinkers in the 1960s, like Abby Hoffman, for example, young activists, even or Angela Davis, um, uh, who become part of various movements, the psychedelic movement, the Black Panthers in the 1960s. The youth movements in the 1960s sometimes chanted, like at Berkeley, death to the death drive. And they want to say, screw this civilization that's trying to repress us, especially in terms of sexuality, and the sexual revolution will sort of come out of that. But that doesn't quite give a full account of what Marcuse is actually saying. Marcuse is saying that we need to do more work than that. And so while a lot of the youth in the 1960s like pointed to Marcuse as kind of like a father figure for the sexual revolution, or for these mass critiques of society, Marcuse says that they don't go far enough. And so that becomes a tension between the critical theorists. Similar tensions between Lacan and youth movements, similar tensions between Adorno and youth movements over in Europe, but for Marcuse, it becomes an especially important thing. So when we try to understand what he means by repressive tolerance in the essay that we read next, I just needed to give a little bit of a suturing kind of talk here to make us think about Freud, because partly like Freud is still with us in many ways in our society, but we have misconceptions about Freud just like we have misconceptions about Marx. We come in with biased feelings without ever having read very much of these people. So I want us to be more generous as readers that way. And that generosity doesn't have to mean that we accept that they were right in their theories, right? That's like not what the point is here. I'm not having us read this stuff because I love all of these people. Like I didn't have us read Horkheimer and Adorno just because I want to just bow down and praise Horkheimer and Adorno. That's not what critical theory or critical reading is. We're trying to trace intellectual developments and ways that people have tried to make sense of really difficult social problems. And if anything, by seeing their mistakes, we hopefully don't repeat the same mistakes. That's what I would hope that studying critical theory in 2024 would be able to do for us. So I'm going to stop there and uh, maybe pick up again with another Marcuse lecture. I have a chapter in my book that does a deeper reading of Eros and Civilization. I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to make a video of that right now. So one might show up and it might not. We might just carry on with repressive tolerance. But if I do that and you're more interested, you can look up my book. It's called A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics. It's a clunky book. And I'm not, of course, talking about psychedelic aesthetics in these lectures, right? So sometimes if you haven't done a bunch of different reading, then that book is not going to be very helpful for you. Anyway, I'm going to log off. Have a great morning, evening, afternoon, day, wherever, whenever you are, and we'll catch up with you in another video lecture.